Amazing. Thank you everyone for joining. Just gonna let everyone settle into their comfortable seats at home before we get started. And please do keep your audio on mute so that we don't get any kind of interruptions as our wonderful panelists are speaking. Okay, everyone has joined, I think. Okay, so welcome to everyone. And if you join while I'm introducing, then you can always catch up on the recording afterwards. Welcome to Friends and Relations, the 43 group, which is a KALＡ ASAP online talk. We're delighted to be joined by Shamil Wanigaratne and Esmerelda Claessen and Rohan de Soysa. Before I introduce our wonderful speakers, I wanted to give a huge thank you to the Sapumal Foundation for supporting KALＡ ASAP programming. And we're really, really excited that we've been able to bring together this talk because we feel that it is more of an anecdotal and familial personal approach to the 43 group, who many people will already know about on this call and whoever will be listening in the future. But I will give a little bit of an introduction first. So the 43 group was led by the visionary photographer, Lionel Wendt, and it distinguished itself in Sri Lanka as a breakaway collective from the Ceylon Society of Arts. Despite lacking a shared stylistic approach, its members were united by a commitment to free expression and a deep appreciation for post-impressionism and expressionism. Fueled by extensive travels and European educations, a significant portion of the group grew disenchanted with conservative attitudes towards modern art in Colombo. I'll list out the group's principal members, which included W.J.G. Belling, Aubrey Collette, Justin Daraniagala, Ivan Pires, Harry Pires, and Lionel Wendt, and George Claessen, Richard Gabriel, and George Keat, and LTP Manjusri, and others. Gathering in Lionel Wendt's refined residence, the group held salon-style meetings. In 1955, they gained international prominence by showcasing their works at the Venice Biennale, where they were celebrated as a radical example of modern Asian art. Unfortunately, the political climate in Sri Lanka turned unfavorably in the mid-1960s, which led to the group's dissolution and prompted several members to emigrate and seek new horizons abroad. I'm going to quickly just say who Shamil, Esmerelda, and Rohan are, if you're not already familiar. Then I'm going to let them introduce themselves. So Shamil is an author and clinical psychologist. Esmerelda is a writer and the daughter of the 43 group founding artist George Claessen. And Rohan is the chairman of the Sapumal Foundation in Colombo. I'm going to ask each of you just to give a short introduction, and then I'll let you come in to talk briefly about our questions. So Shamil, do you want to start?
Well, I think what you said was more than adequate.
Okay.
I've had the privilege of knowing or meeting 3 members of the 43 group, and of course some family members. And I'm not an art historian, I'm a psychologist by profession, as said, but I've also had the privilege of writing 2 monographs on 2 of the artists of the 43 group, George Claessen and LTP Manjusri. That's my connection with the group.
Thank you. Esmeralda?
Yes, I'm George Claessen's daughter. He had 2 children. He had a son as well, but we were brought up in different households, but I'll talk more about that later maybe. Yeah, and I had the privilege of seeing his work as he produced it, which was marvelous. So, yeah.
Thank you. And last but by no means least, Rohan?
Yes, well, Harry Pires, who became the secretary of the 43 group after Lionel Wendt passed on, was my granduncle, my grandmother's brother. He was, my grandmother was the eldest. He was the 8th out of 10. So I've known him pretty much all my life, on and off, because I went abroad for a few years. And when I returned, I drove overland and returned. He asked us for lunch and tea and his wonderful Sunday salons. And then one day he asked me, would I like to be a trustee? So that's how, those are my basic connections, but I'll talk about the others. There are two others I knew quite well. So, but I can discuss that in the talk.
Great. Thank you. And since you've gone last, I can start with you, Rohan.
Yes.
Well, how you've briefly said that Harry Pierce asked you to be a trustee, but how did you begin your work at the Sapumal Foundation, and what was your experience of working with
Well,
Harry and the members of the
yeah,
40? I'm going to
I
put
wasn't an actual working trustee as such.
okay.
So we used to meet at meetings and
Okay.
exhibitions and things like that. And the group I knew was really, best person I knew was Richard Gabriel.
Yeah.
All right. This is a PowerPoint, right? This, you can show that first one.
Okay. Perfect.
The newspaper one.
Yeah.
Because this is on the right, somewhat hidden by the side one, is Ranjit Fernando, who organized all the overseas exhibitions, including the Venice Biennale, which you referred to, and he was Harry's nephew. So that's him with our ambassador at the time at the opening of this Venice Biennale. He's the one who really got me interested in art, because he had two lovely paintings, one by George Keith of a woman and a crow, and the other an Ivan Peiris called The Wave, which I think was the best of that kind which I've seen. I don't know what has happened to them. So yeah. So you can go on to the...
Yeah. And you were related to Ranjit as well?
Yes.
Yes. Another friend and relation.
Another friend and relation, yes. Then that's Harry's niece, who's a ballet dancer on the right. She's now a teacher of ballet. She's a little old. She's about 84 now. And Harry had encouraged her a lot. So when she returned to Sri Lanka, she built a center called the Nelum Arts Center to encourage dancing as well as other arts. So these are an exhibition at the Sapumal.
And who's the person on the left? Is she also, do you remember?
No, she's Lucina Talib,
Oh.
she's an I'm not quite what country of origin is. I think it's something like German.
Nice.
But she and her husband used to come to the exhibitions. That's next one is a picture of Richard Gabriel.
Yeah.
That's a tea party we had for him. He had migrated to Australia and then he returned on a vacation. So he's the one I knew best because I used to go to his house in Panipitia. And so he visited Sri Lanka and did a tour about 15, 20 years after he migrated. And then he said, I don't think I will come back here again because I don't like the changes that are taking place. So that was that. So this is a tea party at the Sapumal. You can see a Manjusri at the back. And yeah, he was the one I knew best. The other was Ivan Peiris, who Senaka Bandaranaike organized a wonderful exhibition for him in Oxford, at the Oxford University, and which I attended. I went to the opening. And so Ivan Peiris was also there.
Yeah.
So, and then once we visited him at his home in Southend. So, so when we visited him at his house, we had a good long chat. And then when we were going back to the railway station, he accompanied us. Then he suddenly, about halfway or 3/4 of the way through, he said, my God, what am I doing here? I said, we are taking us back. No, but I haven't stepped out of the house for 6 months. So I said, it's not so bad, is it? So fresh air will do you good and so on. And then he laughed and walked with us. And after then, he had been painting tiny paintings on the back of cigarette packets, on the silver wrappings of the cigarettes those days. And I'm told that he started painting proper paintings after that. So the other person I visited was George Claessen, but I didn't know him very well. I used to go with Harry Pires to his house, where he was living with his Indian wife and possibly wife stroke friend, and maybe both wife stroke friends. So that was somewhere in Nubegoda, somewhere around Nubegoda, I believe. So that was many, many years ago. So by the time I became a trustee of the 43 group, it was not active as a group. This is the second chairman on the right and our secretary. They were there for a long time, and then two friends. I think right at the end is Manel Fonseca, who was Senaka Bandaranaka's wife. And in the middle is Aisha Abdul Rahman, who has a thing called Lanka Decorative Arts. They promote decorative arts. So you can see the description of what Lankeswar has done. So he was instrumental in getting this Sapumal Foundation collection, a select catalog. Because Neville had been trying for about 10 or 12 years to get us to do a book. He said Sapumal must have a book. And then he offered, he said, I don't want any payment, but you give me 7 copies and I will do all the sort of editing part and layout and so on. So then he said, but we must find a photographer. So that was an offer I couldn't really, not that he looked at me, but so I offered to do the same thing, which is how I came to do that. And
so you photographed
the
collection? You photographed it?
Yes, I photographed all the whole collection and measured the paintings. And I'm not very expert at identifying paintings, whether it's oil on canvas or gouache or whatever, but I measured them. So that is that. Then it was a pleasure working with the Sapumal Foundation. With first with Harry Pires, then Mr. Lankeswar Pires, whom we just saw, who was second chairman, and he was a chairman for 22 years. And then when he was in his mid-80s, he said, I think I should step down as chairman, but he continued as a trustee for another year or two. He's still around, gives us good advice from time to time. So it was a pleasure working there. Shortly after I became a trustee, we had an exhibition of caricatures and cartoons by Bevis Bava. And the exhibition was very successful. And that led to the publication of a book called Briefly by Bevis. Now that book has sold out, and the second print has also sold out. Amazing. So what we did, there were sort of small prints, like 500 or 1,000, black and white. And so now what we do is we photocopy them and bind them and have them for sale. So that's a wonderful collection of cartoons as well as articles that Bevis used to give the newspapers. So having had the privilege of seeing the artwork, artifacts, and archival materials of the Sapumal, I did get to understand something of the mindset of the artists. And so that was, which I kind of absorbed it sort of more by default than anything else. And also we have a large amount of newspaper cuttings, several large volumes. Right from the beginning of the 43 group, there's an article written by Murmur Anand for Marg magazine. So we had a few magazines lying around, and various people offered to catalog them over about 7 or 8 years, but nobody did. So then finally, there was a young lady who was willing to do it, and so she cataloged them, put them in order, and I photographed the cover and the contents page, so that so you have a list of the people who wrote, which includes George Keaton, Harry Pearce, and so on, Minette de Silva, and others, and so that it's easy for people to locate a particular magazine. So, so by absorbing, as I say, the things in the group, I began to see the differences in their approach. George Keats was that of line and form. Harry Pearce's was the capture of the people, portraits, people's faces and the nuances. And so like that, there were others. Collett had this modern wit, political wit, satirical, but absolutely on the nail, which is quite wonderful. Perhaps one of the best cartoonists maybe in the world. Ivan Pearce had figures, form and figure, simple, basically a house very often in the background, and coconut tree and seas. That was his theme. Even after he went to England and lived there for the rest of his life, he still had these paintings were of scenes from Ceylon, probably in his hometown, in the Himalaya. So, and Richard Gabriel, Lionel Wayne's photos, of course, have the wonderful tonal quality. His lighting is superb. And Richard Gabriel had a deep feeling and empathy for the farmers and the fishermen. He was a very religious person as well. And so he's done a lot of woodcuts, sort of showing the lifestyles of the farmers and fishermen. And he felt that although it was a simple lifestyle, they had plenty of time to sit back and dream in their spare time. Now, perhaps they are not dreaming so much, but they are tending to drink and stuff like that. But in those days, they were sort of much better that way. And I think the Lionel Went was a photographer, and the 43 group was the first group in Asia, art group in Asia, about 4 or 5 years before the Indian and Pakistani ones. So I feel that it was a cohesive group because Lionel Went has a different discipline. So he was not seen as a rival by the others who were painters. So the group was reasonably cohesive for about 20, 25 years. And Lionel Went also had a wide interest in performing arts, especially Canadian dancing. And Harry Pearce, again, was a specialist portrait painter. So there was no clash between him and George Keat or Ivan Pearce, whose painting styles are quite different. So it was interesting to get to know, how those things worked and how they were able to get on. But there were occasional bits of friction, but nothing sort of very major till eventually they started drifting off to Australia and UK and countries like that. So that's about it.
Thank you, Rohan. I think you've obviously, by being immersed in it, you say you don't know the difference in techniques, but I think you understand the mindset of each artist, and it's such a nice way to kind of go into more of a specialist kind of conversation with Esmerelda now, to kind of, you grew up with your father,
yes.
George Claessen, and I wanted to kind of ask you to talk about your personal interaction with your father as your father, but also as such a wonderful artist as part of this group. And I know you have a few things you want to share, so over to you, Esmerelda.
Okay, thank you. Just that as I was growing up, and he did have another son, but we lived in separate households. He had a wife in Sri Lanka called Ines de Kretser, and he never divorced her. And then he met my mother when he came to London, and she was 25 years his junior. Unfortunately, that doesn't make me any younger, but still. And but as I was growing up, he showed me all the work that he did. That was something we would have a cup of tea when I lived in the house, and he would without saying anything, he would just put all these works, stand them up and wait for me to comment on them. And of course, as a teenager, I wasn't that. I said, oh yeah, right. Well, I like that one. I don't like that one. I like that one. As teenagers are very offhand. But it was very good that I saw them all, because something must have been going in my brain, because now I can recognize his work. And unfortunately, there's lots of fakes around now. But because he showed me pretty much everything he did, I can spot them a mile off. In fact, I'm starting to recognize the works of the forgers as well. They've got their own style. But anyway, that was quite interesting. Yeah, he painted every single day. If he wasn't actually painting, then he was making a frame or something like that. The only time he stopped was when he was writing poems. And I was very fond of his poems. I particularly liked them. And what else? Oh yeah, he kept everything. He kept a massive sort of archive of everything. He was involved in all the exhibitions, all the galleries that he showed at. He kept everything. And now his archive, which is quite huge, and I'm still kind of putting it together, has got its own fan base, and people are very interested in that, including you, Mala, I believe, various other people who are interested in the academic side. In fact, I have something here to show you. I have a postcard. Whoops. A postcard from, sorry, we're now in white gloves territory, so I'm keeping this in its wrapper. We have a postcard from Lionel Went. And I don't know if you can see that very well. And it's pre-43 group. And he says here, okay, sorry, let me just get the transcript, which has fallen over. And it says here, Claessen had an exhibition just before the 43 group. And this is dated the 7th of July, the 4th of July in 1943. And Lionel Went says, I feel I must tell you that when I went round to the show this morning, I got the biggest thrill from your exquisitely gay and utterly satisfying picture. It had all the astonishing rightness of Picasso's saying, I do not seek, I discover. Salute, LW, for Lionel Went. And yeah, that was that picture. And I also have another interesting note from Lionel Went. I'll just put it up here, and it's 2 sides. And this was the reason. It was dated the 29th of September 1943, and this is the reason why he couldn't attend the inaugural 43 group meeting. And he says here, now George Claessen was the treasury of the 43 group, and he says, my dear Claessen, I am enclosing my subscription to the 43 group, 5 rupees, and apologize for my delay. The fact is, I wasn't there, and it isn't possible to get postal orders where I stay most of the time. I was very pleased to hear that such a mandala has definitively been formed. I felt honored to see my name on the committee. Please convey my regards to Ivan Peiris. I was sorry to miss the meeting, and as I phoned to Lionel Went, I thought it wasn't necessary to inform Ivan Peiris that I couldn't attend. Besides, I was about to leave Kandy at that moment. With kind regards, yours sincerely, George Keat. And that comes from 43 Gregory Road, Kandy, on the 29th of September, 1943. So that's quite interesting. And these, fortunately, he kept all these documents. So that was marvelous.
Amazing. And you also have, I think, one more thing you wanted to share with us.
Oh yes, the poems, yeah, from this book here. Yeah, I'll read out a poem I like. I quite like this one. Okay, and I have memorized it, but I'll read it just to make sure that I don't mess it up. Okay, and this is called Flute. Okay, and this is one of my favorites. There are plenty of other ones, and they're all quite different. They're not the same. I'll read it out. Flute. Flute, stretch and coil, swim in a river of dark shining facets, turn and gambol, utter your piercing shriek, to fly like a ribbon from shoulder to shoulder of terrible hills. Silver, unanswered flute, frightened by lambs. That's one I particularly like. And there is another poem I'll read if I can find it. Oh, yes. Now, this is quite interesting, this poem. I mean, you may or may not know that George was considered to be a mystic among the group. And that was because I think he had a kind of experience when he went to Melbourne. He went to Melbourne, I think it was 1947, and he was there for about a year, less than a year maybe. But it was very significant because he not only he had this kind of experience, very mystical experience, which he writes about in a poem called The Day. And I think after that kind of inspired him to start doing abstracts, which is around 1948 by that time. And anyway, I just want to say he had 3 partners that I'm aware of. And the first was Ines de Kretser, his official wife, then my mother. And then later after that was Betsa Payne, and she was also an artist. And they were very close. And I think that was probably the most successful of his relationships. Anyway, after he died, it must have been a few months after, I think, not more than about 6 months. I went to see Betsa because she lives very near. I went up to see her, and she was telling me that she'd had a strange, well, I guess, experience in the morning. She was sitting on her sofa, and I think it was quite sunny. And she said, I had this extraordinary experience. And I said, what, Betsa, what happened? And she said, well, I felt all these lights sort of around my head, and there was some kind of, I don't know, light in the room. And she said, and I felt something, she couldn't really explain it very well, but what she did explain, I said, oh my goodness, that sounds a bit like one of his poems. There's a poem he wrote which sounds like that. So I read out the poem, and this is the poem. Yeah, I'm going to read in a second. And when I read it, she said, oh yes, that was exactly what I felt. Okay, I'll read out the poem. On some bright morning, when the sun is shining, I shall sparkle around you, momentarily placing a gold tiara on your head. You would not know of such a happening. You would say, the sun is beautiful. The sun is so grand. And that was the poem. So quite amazing, really. So anyway, one thing he always said was that we outlived our consciousness lives on after we die. And my regret is not asking him more about that. I wanted to know why he believed that and why he thought that. But unfortunately, I didn't ask how he came to think that. So that's a mystery that will remain, I'm afraid.
Thank you. And it's I mean, it's how we met, but I urge anyone who's in London to, is it still on, the exhibition?
Yes, it's on until the 24th of February in Highgate.
Go
Yes.
see George's works in Highgate, and it's actually how we started to interact with Esmeralda. And I'm going to ask a question to all of you after I've given a chance to Shamil to speak really about this resurgence in interest in the 43 group. But I know that Esmeralda and Rohan both know Shamil very well, and Shamil has been working with you both in various ways. And I wanted to ask you, Shamil, what are your earliest memories of the 43 group, and how did they fuel your interest as a writer and researcher about some of the artists in the group?
About the 43 group, my earliest memories was of George Keat, who was a friend of my mother, and my mother had known him since her school days at Hillwood College, Candy, where George Keat did the deco for the school play. I think it was on not on Mother Chitra, but somehow a Jataka story. So my recollections is that he would drop by when he's passing and have a chat, and it was this kind of funny man. He was kind of, I think people who knew him and relatives wouldn't object. He was pompous kind of character, and that's my memories of him. But also I recall his second wife, when he was married on Manique, was a very kind and very gentle soul, and his two sons. So they were a little bit older than me, but we used to go to the Manique and George's house in Sirumalwatta and used to play. And I remember his studio, which was a very large room full of canvases, and my most greater interest was the gramophone player. And his sons and I, we would, play records and sing and play. But so those were my introduction to the 43 group as such. And I had no interest in art whatsoever. My mother was. And then it kind of started when I was studying in the UK. When I went back home for holidays, I started visiting George Keat, and when I was in London, I kind of began to visit museums and galleries and developed an interest in art. And then I thought, and my mother said, you must go and meet George. So I started visiting him. And again, that's when I really got the interest and a sense of him. And as I said, he was pompous, he was opinionated, and I think Rohan touched upon it earlier on, where he didn't have anything positive to say about any of the other artists. So essentially saying he was the best. But he did pontificate. But he was very nice, and he said, "Oh, have you got anything of mine?" But I must give you something, and he never did. But also another character that people recall of him was he was always concerned about money. But he was the most successful, I think, artist in his lifetime of the 43 group. So interestingly, what he did do was introduce me to Martin Russell. He never mentioned that George Claessen lived in London, anything to do with Ivan Peiris, nothing. But he said, you must meet Martin Russell. And he gave me his address. I wrote to him, and he immediately got in touch. And he's the one who really introduced me to the 43 group, and George Claessen. So he said, George, this is his address, you must go and see him. And I gave me a number. I phoned George, and one day, and he said, where Esme now lives, happens to be on my route to work from North London to Central London. So I dropped in one day, and this beaming little person, the lovely smile, opened the door, and I was hooked. From then on, I started to drop in for tea on my way home, and he would, like Esme would show, bring me trays and trays of paintings and show me these works. And I knew very little about art, so but he explained some of it. But it was an experience that I really, look back and treasure. And then one day we had this conversation. I said, George, has anybody written anything about you? And he said, no. I said, can I? because what I thought was, as a psychologist, I can get a biography of him, and that would help understand his art and whatever. But I was absolutely wrong. He was not a good historian in terms of his personal life or biography. But I think he stated this, that art should do the talking. But I got to know him and then started researching for the book and interviewed him over the years. I think for 3 or 4 years I would drop in and record his work, bits of his life and explanations. So I would say that I got to know him very well, and through George and Martin Russell, I got to know all the other characters of the 43 group. If you want to put the
Yeah,
the
let me share that
photo,
now.
then I think that might remind me of the
I'll ask you
people.
when you wanted me to. Perfect.
Yeah, if you can expand it. So
Hit this full screen.
the picture on the left is George Keat and my ex-wife, Natasha's mom, and in the house in Sirimalwata. But the picture in the center is interesting because that is a family photograph with Manike, George Keat, who's sitting down, and Kusum Narayan, his other partner, on the right side, and his son Sachin. I think Prem unfortunately died. I think he had an alcohol problem and died quite young. And the two children must be Sachin's children, and somewhere in there is me. So that kind of captures George Keats' life. And the wonderful people I got to know. And on the right side is Betsa Payne and George Claessen at my place in North London. And in between the two pictures are Martin Russell and again Sue, my ex-wife. Just below that is the bottom side is Ian Gunatilaka, who I think was a key figure of in terms of the group. He knew them all, he worked with them, and he was the librarian of the University of Peradeniya. And his archives, his correspondence with them, I hope it's preserved and saved because it's a gem. And the other ones are with Richard Gabriel. I didn't get to know him that well, but I met him a few times and also visited him in Australia. So it's kind of a very personal association. But in the picture are also Veronica Pires, Ivan Pires's wife, showing a painting that I subsequently bought, showing me a painting. And of course, Ranjit is probably the only person who's not there. And the other people, of course, is Neville Weeraratne and his wife, Sybil Keat. They were all people who were closely associated with the group. And a point I want to make, Mala, is that as far as I know, and Rohan might be able to correct me, I don't think any art historian or expert has interviewed any member of the 43 group about their art as such, as we see today, like Melvin Bragg interviewing David Hockney, or Sudarshan Chetty being interviewed, or Anish Kapoor being interviewed, and you could go to YouTube and you see all these interviews where the artist describes their art. And as far as I know, I don't think this has been done with members of the 43 group. And of course, when I interviewed George Claessen, I was interviewing him as a psychologist, not as a art historian, although he talked about his art. But I lacked the expertise. So, and of course, very few of their contemporaries are alive today. But importantly, like with Esmeralda, their children are alive, and I really hope that what you guys are doing, this talk, the KALÅ festival, all that would kind of pull these people out, and I hope you will build an archive of interviews with people who knew these artists or their children, because it will be lost. And before memory fades, I feel that it should be done. Now, the Esmeralda, I thought you mentioned this, but there is a film being made about George Claessen currently, and it's going to be out soon.
Yes, it's going to be out.
And that, I think, is a step in the right direction. Maybe there are films need to be made about all of these artists, but the memories, their personal associations, their characters. To bring them alive, you need people who've known them, because years later we will be reading into these artists things that they weren't, or
Yes.
not that accurate. So I really want to congratulate KALÅ and Art South Asia for starting this, and I hope that it grows into a kind of a sizable archive for the future. I don't know whether I answered your question or
No, you really did. And I think all of you actually have given such wonderful stories. And as you said, it's best to look at these artists through those who knew them. And even just recording this conversation is a beginning of an archiving process about these stories. And hope, as you said, Shamil, hopefully we can continue that through KALÅ and our ASAP initiative. I have two questions of my own before I open up to the audience, where I'll give a little bit of a Q&A moment. One of my questions is about the past, and one of them is about kind of looking towards the future about these artists. And my first one is really, as I think it was Rohan, you said this, the 43 group was started before the progressive artist group and the Lahore Art Circle, which were both started in 1947. However, it seems like the progressives and the Lahore Art Circle have gained more international recognition in art history, but also in the art market. Do you agree with that? And how do you think we could change the kind of recognition of the 43 group? So this kind of does go into the future, but what are your thoughts as all three major stakeholders in the 43 group on making the art history around these artists more important?
If I can just say something, I mean, one thing I forgot to say about George before I'll say that was, as much as I mentioned George Keith being kind of, if I want to call it, conceited and pompous, but he knew he was good, and he wasn't shy about saying it. George Claessen was exactly the opposite. His humility was touching, and so was Richard Gabriel, as my association with him. So there were two totally opposite personalities. George Claessen is the one who recommended to Martin Russell that when Martin Russell asked him whether he should buy George Keith painting, he said, I think he recommended that he bought the whole lot. Martin always used to say that. And I don't think any other artist from the group would be so altruistic or generous with their opinions and appreciation of the other artists. But just to answer your question, the 43 group had its associations and leaning with Shantiniketan long before I think from the 1930s. And Harry Pires, Rohan's granduncle, I think taught there for a while. And Manjushri was there in the early 30s, and he was influenced by not Germany, but Nandalal Bose. So the Indian influence was there in the 43 group, and it helped there. But then the 43 group kind of came out as a movement, and then the other two countries. But I think historically, I think sort of the roots there were strong connections with India. Ananda Kumarasamy and the Tagores were very close. I think they worked together. So there was an Indian influence, but as a group to be formed, I think the 43 group would have been the first for modern art. But for the future, I don't know, Rohan.
I think the Indian people like Jamini Roy and Hussain and so on, it's something that happened, because they were perhaps more heavily marketed or advertised or whatever. And maybe their art somehow resonates more with the European and possibly with the American art buyers' inclination. They may not always, George Keith is also very popular, but that is something that has happened. There's no special reason why we should boost the 43 group as such. it's something that can happen naturally if it does.
Yeah.
And none of our artists were that prolific. I mean, very few of them were. I mean, Keith was, and one or two others. But the Indian artists were very much more prolific. So, you know, I think that's partly why, and so on, live abroad. So I think our artists were not necessarily, other than George Keith, they were not pushing for. And more than George Keith, I think it was his wife, Kusum, who really popularized him in India. And there was some kind of story which is apocryphal, I think, that she used to put him in a room and say, once you've done a painting, you can come out and have your breakfast, some story like that. But I think that's not entirely true. Keith, I think, would not have stood for that. But anyway, so they painted with some kind of commitment and authenticity. The 43 group people, possibly more than the Indians and the Pakistanis. I could be wrong. I don't know much about Indian and Pakistani art. I mean, certainly people like Jamini Roy did some very beautiful works. So, so I don't quite know how the future will go. I gather that some 3 Keats were sold recently at Bonham's, and they had fetched quite a good price, drawings. So that some theories might have more to say about that.
Sorry, could I just recommend a book if anyone who's interested in George Keith, and that's Buddha to Krishna by Yashadora Dalmia, and it's excellent. It reads like a novel. I mean, I sort of fell in love with Keith after that. I know he's a bit of a character, but I mean, you couldn't make him up as a writer. I mean, I couldn't make up half of these 43 group artists. I mean, they're such larger than life characters. They really are. I mean, there's some amazing stories about them. And by the way, I did know Ivan. I met Ivan Peiris because he was living in London at the time, and as I was growing up, we met them, and he made a very strong impression on me. I mean, I loved his work anyway, but he was such a kind of effervescent character. You could just feel the energy just like coming out of him like electricity. It was incredible, He really was a force of nature, I think. So that was nice. And we would get Christmas cards from Richard Gabriel, little woodblock, beautiful little woodblock cards. That was nice. So that was really my only connection to the other members.
I might just give some exciting things that are happening about the 43 group currently, just to, as you say, looking towards the future, and then open up to the questions. So we obviously are part of KALÀ, and KALÀ was curated by Mariam Begum and Pivot Glide Echo, and there are many wonderful 43 group artists, some from Shamil's own collection in the exhibition, and it's a really wonderful look at their legacy on modern contemporary art, especially through the lens of Lionel Went. We've got George Claessen's show open for 11 more days in Highgate in London. We've got Ivan Peiris exhibition opening at Grosvenor this week in London as well. And I was mentioning to the group before we started the call, but George Keith will be included in this year's Venice Biennale. So hopefully this kind of resurgence or interest will just keep going. And as you just said, Rohan, we've had a good sale of Keith's work at Bonham's too. So it's an exciting moment. I've spoken a lot and we've spoken a lot, so let's just have a look at the questions. So the first question is from Wolf, actually, and could you talk a little bit more about the George Claessen film, please? Maybe Esmeralda.
Oh yes. Well, it's getting longer and longer. It was supposed to be 20 minutes, but it's kind of extended because there's so much archive material for them to use. So it is getting longer. I'm not sure if they will do any kind of event with it, like some kind of other material of Claessen's work. I don't know. We'll have to see. I haven't seen any of the film yet, so it will be quite interesting to see how it's done. I believe it's probably quite a creative film because the filmmaker is very well known, I believe, and he's done Sundance and he's been nominated for an Oscar and all sorts. So he's quite a renowned documentary maker. Rob Lemkin, his name is, and he's working together with the director of Three Highgate, Irina Johnston. So between them, they're putting their input into it. So yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing it. And I think it will come out in spring sometime, and it will be shown at an independent cinema in London somewhere, as far as we know.
Very exciting. Can you keep us posted? And we'll obviously
Yes, I will.
share that. I answered one question already about the book you just recommended, so we don't need to go through that. But we have a lovely question about, is the 43 group taught about in art schools, colleges in Sri Lanka? And Sabi has asked, I think dissemination through pedagogy makes a big difference because artists become the spokespersons of such art histories. He studied art history and cultural studies in India, and George Keith's work was taught in some of the courses.
Yes. It is actually taught.
Okay.
43 group is an A-level art subject.
Okay.
And the Sapumal Foundation is the only gallery open to the public, which has works by all the 10 co-artists plus various others. So a lot of students come to Sapumal because they're mainly bigger collections in private hands. But the 43 group main artists, and they were all bought by Harry Pires. So the authenticity is not in doubt. So that's one thing. Yes, the 43 group is being brought to the attention of the younger group.
And also, Mala, for the question you raised before, I think as the economic axis is moving from the west to the east, the interest in Asian art and is also have a sense that the interest is going up, and 43 group would also benefit. Ironically, if I can say some political note, at least one presidential candidate in Sri Lanka at the moment says that one of the biggest mistakes Sri Lanka made at the time of independence and the time of the 43 group, it's very relevant, that we, understandably coming out of a colonial period, wanted to go back to the glorious past. And this group were mostly, I think, left-wing, most of them, and were radicals, were wanted to become modern and go to the future. And the point made is that the countries that had a strategy that was to modernize, like Singapore or India, I think has overtaken Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka has now, 70 years later, is looking at the country and thinking, where has it gone wrong? So 43 group was ahead of their time, and I think their time is coming now. If I might give that humble opinion.
Do you, Esmeralda or Rohan, want to add any ideas on Shamil's proposition?
No, I think Shamil said
it. It's a question I never asked, and when I was interviewed for the film by Rob, I was thinking there were so many questions I would like to go back and ask George. Similarly, did he ever talk to you about his political leanings, or?
I think he was on the left for sure. Maybe not completely radical, but yes, he was on the left for sure, definitely. He always voted Labour, which is
right. So yeah, and I think most of them, certainly Lionel Went was, and I think, and the people associated with George Keith, Harold Pearce, all that, I think they were very kind of left-wing characters. Yeah. But I think the point was that they saw modernism as the future and not the glorious past, and that's clearly the majority wanted to go back to the glorious past. But these would have been a sort of a silent minority that probably has been now proved right.
Yes, well, when they started in the 40s, there were all these new forms of art coming out, cubism and, you know, all sorts of, and abstracts and so on and so forth. So they were all sort of forging their own sort of expression of those, the newfangled arts, you know, which was a radical departure from the, you know, the temple paintings or the Victorian style paintings, you know, so they were really kind of blazing a trail. But it all happened organically. That was the wonderful thing about it. You know, it all just kind of fell into place like a jigsaw somehow. So.
And I was going to say that they, as you said, Cubism and abstract movements, they were looking at European modernism or more. They were looking at the French as an influence rather than the British.
Yes, in the case of abstracts, it was probably America that kind of, you know, put that forward, you know, the abstract art. But it was very difficult for Claessen then because there was only one gallery that was showing abstract art in the 50s at that time. And lots of people didn't understand it, especially in London. It really wasn't the place to be for an abstract artist. He would have done much better in New York, I think, had he been there. I don't think New York registered much then in Ceylon, as it was called at that time. You know, everyone thought about Paris and, you know, France. And
even Darren Geller and I think Harry Pearce, they studied art in London, but they at least spent some time in Paris.
Yes.
So Paris was the kind of center, and Martin Russell always proudly announced that his mother was drawn by Matisse. There's all this connection towards Paris.
Yes, when George Claessen first came to London, he was met at Gravesend off the boat by Ivan Pearce and Lester Pearce. I remember that story.
Yeah.
It was nice.
Thank you. I feel like we all got such a lovely insight into this. Really, really was about friends and relations with all three of you. It really feels like, I mean, especially Esmeralda and Rohan is familial connection, and Shamil familial through your mother as well. That kind of beginnings, instigation of relating with these artists. I know I learned a lot, and I could continue listening in this panel discussion, and I hope that our audience also learned a lot and enjoyed what they were listening to, and I'm sure they did. I wanted to thank you all for giving your time to this discussion, and thank you also to Noor Aslam for preparing this call. Unfortunately, she's unwell, so couldn't do this, but I was very happy to step in. And thank you to the Faisal Shabana Foundation for supporting this program. If anyone has missed this talk will be online soon, so we will make sure to share the recordings. And have a lovely rest of your day or afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for chairing it so nicely.
Thank you very much. It's been very exciting to be here.
Yeah. Thank you so much. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.